In January 1944, America's naval offensive in the Pacific moved on to the Marshall Islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the U.S. naval commander in the Central Pacific, was anxious to avoid another bloodbath. So, aircraft from his carrier force bombed Japanese airfields on the islands for nearly 2 months. Finally, on February the 1st, 1944, he sent in the assault forces. The flat and open island of Roy was quickly overrun. But the islands of Kwajalein and Namur were wooded, and the Japanese resisted fanatically. US forces used flamethrowers and explosives. The Japanese responded by launching suicidal banzai charges. But the US forces now knew what to expect. The Japanese were beaten back. Over 8,000 Japanese soldiers died for the loss of less than 400 US lives. Atoll after atoll in the Marshall Islands now fell to the US advance. Kwajalein was followed by Atoll. The island of Truk was bypassed and cut off. Though a small Japanese garrison would remain undefeated until the end of the war. The way was now clear for the next push, 1,000 miles west towards the Mariana Islands. If captured, the islands would put the Japanese mainland within range of US heavy bombers. They would also enable America to block Japan's supply lines from Southeast Asia. On June 11, 1944, the US started to soften up the 3 main islands in the Marianas. Four days later, Marines stormed the beaches of the northerly island of Saipan. This time, the terrain was mountainous, with many caves, and the preliminary bombardment had not disrupted the Japanese defenses as much as had been hoped. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, the American bridgehead was secure. In Tokyo, the news caused mounting alarm. The Japanese High Command now sent a carrier fleet to rescue the situation and save the Marianas. But the task force was spotted by US submarines. The Americans sent their main carrier force to intercept the Japanese. On the morning of June the 19th, 1944, the Japanese launched airstrikes against the US ships. But US radar saw them coming. "450 fighters were scrambled to intercept the Japanese planes. It turned into the largest aircraft carrier battle ever fought. The US task force had 15 aircraft carriers and more than 900 aircraft. Ranged against it, the Japanese had 9 carriers and nearly 500 aircraft. But Japan had lost many of its experienced air crews during the Solomon and Marshall Islands campaigns. Its novice pilots faced battle-hardened US flyers. The Japanese were outgunned and outfought. It would go down in history as the great Marianas turkey shoot. Half an hour into the battle, a torpedo from a US submarine hit the newest and largest Japanese carrier, the Taiho, while she was still launching aircraft. The Battle of the Philippine Sea had claimed its first major victim. At around the same time, another US submarine torpedoed the carrier Shokaku. She was completely destroyed. Nevertheless, the Japanese commander decided to continue with the operation, hoping to stop further US landings in the Marianas. For much of the following day, the US forces tried to pin down the exact location of the remaining Japanese carriers.
Bearing 096.
It took them until the afternoon to find them. It was late in the day to launch an attack, and the aircraft would have to fly at the limit of their range. But the US Task Force commander, Admiral Mark Mitcher, decided to gamble and attack. A third Japanese carrier, the Hayo, was hit and sunk. The Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft. But as the US planes now returned, dangerously short of fuel, they ran into a problem. In the gathering darkness, they couldn't find their own carriers. Many ran out of fuel and had to ditch in the sea. Mitcher, in an act of extraordinary courage, ordered his carriers to switch on their lights to guide in the returning aircraft. Fortunately for the Americans, there were no Japanese submarines to see them. Nevertheless, over 80 US planes were lost, either through having to ditch in the sea or through crashing while they landed. But Japanese losses had been even greater. 3 carriers and most of the aircraft needed to equip its remaining carrier fleet were gone. From now on, the United States Navy would dominate the Pacific, striking when and where it wanted.